everyone. We are pleased tonight to have Bennett Dowling, who is the organic landscape horticulturist for the 577 Foundation in Perrysburg. He has an extensive background in horticulture, landscape design, and nursery sales. He has gardened in Arizona, Southwest Ohio, and South Carolina before moving to Toledo in 2020. For a number of seasons, he was the Southwestern Ohio regional reporter for the Ohio Gardener magazine. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Bennett for his wonderful program, Beauty in Nature, Native Landscaping Through the Seasons.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Angie and Kate, for the introduction. I am so excited to be here talking to you all tonight. When I heard how many people were registered, that just made my heart flutter a little. That's about 15 times more than I'm used to talking to. I did work a lot in Cincinnati over the years with the Wild Ones Southwest Ohio chapter. I have not gotten to work as much or meet many of you just yet, but I am excited for that to happen. As they said, I have gardened in multiple climates. But the Midwest has always had my heart. So I was very happy to come back here and pick up my gardening hat in Northwest Ohio, which is where my parents are both from, this region. I'd never lived here until 2 years ago, but this is their hometown. So thank you for having me. When we talked about topics to present for this February meeting, we had originally mentioned some different things that you all might be interested in. And a couple things that came up were designing with natives to fit into the built environment, and just, you know, the usual topic of really great native annuals, perennials, shrubs, trees, things like that. So I kind of combined a few of those together. I do have a background in landscape design, so that is always an interest. And I will warn you, I am one of those people that will talk about cultivars a little. I know that's a naughty word to some, but I will bring it up here and there. And it just is what happens when you've worked in the nursery trade for a long time. And to me, it is exciting that if that's one way to get people planting more natives, it's better than nothing. So without further ado, we will go into the presentation, and then we'll have time at the end for questions and answers. And hopefully you're able to print up the plant list if you want to write down any notes as we go. Okay, so let's see here. Okay, so this is the Beauty in Nature Landscaping Through the Seasons. This is a photo from Longwood Gardens in Pennsylvania. It was just the biggest sweep of native goat's beard I have ever seen, and I just fell in love with it. So I had to include it. Okay, so one of the things that we will talk about is gardening in the urban environment. As most of us are in some level of the urban world, we are dealing with a lot of the challenges of the built environment, which is a depleted native plant environment, greater prevalence of invasive species, and often changed conditions regarding soil, water movement, all the different things that you might not necessarily see in a more rural area. The thing that's exciting is native plants compared to 15, 20 years ago are really getting mainstream attention. And a lot of that's come through the challenges towards pollinators, the press surrounding the monarch population collapse. So all of it, even though it is kind of like gateways to the community, it really is getting people to talk about it a lot more. And I would say in the past 15 years, I really started seeing more and more of the market finally responding with greater promotion and production of native plants arriving in garden centers, even in places like Lowe's. The American Beauty series came out, which was kind of the proven winners version for native plants. And we're starting to notice a change in the ethos of the American public towards more natural landscaping. There's still a large challenge towards more natural looking yards, but there's a lot more people accepting of it, and a lot more people appreciating how much diversity and interest happens in a yard that speaks to the natural environment. So this is from the Mount Cuba Center in Delaware. If any of you, being native plant lovers, have time to travel that way, it is paradise for a native plant lover. This is just one of their little areas, and their gardens are designed, but are providing the environment so ideal for these native plants that they tend to just colonize and do their own thing again, but in a very orchestrated way that is quite beautiful. So the great thing about a designed native plant garden is that some of the best techniques that will create a well-designed, beautiful garden are also some of the things that guarantee that it is the most beneficial for the environment. So when we are designing a native plant border that, like I said, is aesthetically pleasing, a lot of the design principles that go into good landscape design are mimicking in some way or another the natural world. So some of those things are mass plantings, including a diversity of species, choosing the right plants for the right places, and then working really hard to have continuous color and texture interest. So color doesn't just have to be flowers. It can be foliage color, bark color, and like I said, texture interest, because a garden that is even monochromatic but is a million different textures is just as interesting as a very colorful garden. And then lastly, mimicking nature. A garden with multiple layers is so important, not only for the eye, but for a lot of the flora and fauna that depend on those microclimates that occur in a multi-layered environment. So how do we go about choosing plants? Well, according to the Xerces Society in a little book called 100 Plants to Feed the Bees, they kind of mentioned that over a dozen species of flowering plants in the garden really starts to get you on the path towards a really well-balanced environment. And at least 3 of these species blooming at any one time, so that you have a diversity of pollinators being fed by a diversity of flowers. So you don't have just all black-eyed Susans and coneflowers blooming at the same time, because they cater to a lot of the same insects. And then varying heights and growth habits. Once again, you're creating those microclimates, those shelter spaces, all those different things that happen when you have very tall plants shading over shorter plants and lower plants weaving between them. So one of the things, my friend in Cincinnati, a naturalist, had been anecdotally researching all his native plantings for years and noticing that plants produce, or that plants producing flowers in different shapes or forms, which would be called their morphology, are addressing the needs of different pollinators very distinctly. So he was working harder and harder to incorporate flowers of a diverse range of flower shapes so that he could be addressing the needs of pollinating wasps or flies as much as honeybees, as much as bumblebees or carpenter bees. Because what you find is flowers that are maybe deep-throated and have a nectar source deep down are only beneficial to strong bees like bumblebees that can wedge in there or chew their way through. But a honeybee or a fly might not be able to get in there. Meanwhile, though, a flower like a helianthus or a black-eyed Susan or goldenrod, for example, has a very accessible flower. So everyone can be appealing to it. And then lastly, flowers like Joe Pye weed or elderberry, things like that that have what's called an umbel or a large flat flower cluster, not only appeal to all those guys, but also are beneficial for butterflies that need a platform to land on when they're getting the nectar source. So what you see is if only one of those species was available, it would be catering to some, but not a larger diversity of pollinators. When you have a mix of all those different morphologies or anatomies of flowers, you start to get this really great buffet for pollinators. And what he found, that I don't know if it's been proven in literature, but he found very intriguing, was stronger bees like bumblebees and stuff are kind of bullies. They're big and kind of cumbersome. So when they would land on a black-eyed Susan, it would kind of scare away all the smaller pollinators. But when bumblebees had something that only they could use, such as a bee balm or a penstemon, that would keep them distracted enough that the little kids could still enjoy the other flowers. So it was kind of his way of creating a little bit of a distraction so that everyone could have something. So, and then when we are placing plants, as we talked about, mass plantings or larger groups of similar plants are really important for pollinators and birds and different things. Using plants in clumps of at least 4 square feet is ideal. That's still a pretty small cluster, but it at least starts to give you not only aesthetically pleasing impact, but it gives you a greater reserve of pollen, nectar, seed, shelter, things like that. And then reusing those similar species in multiple spaces of the garden. So that replicates some of what we would actually see in the natural world, where when you look at a beautiful prairie, say at Wildwood, you don't just see one cluster of butterfly weed and then a cluster of cow vetch and then a cluster of oxeye daisy. What you see is colonies of them throughout, peppered throughout the space, weaving with other important species for shelter or different things like that. So different ways that you can incorporate these design implements and still play by the rules of our built environment would be what I like to call intentional chaos. This is one of my absolute favorite landscape architects, Michael van Valkenburg. My first experience with him was he did the grad school for architecture grounds at OSU. And I just fell in love with it. And he uses largely natives in what he calls hyper nature or super nature, which is he just plants it so dense like it would be in nature and lets the plants duke it out until they can establish their own hierarchies like what would happen in an old field. But what he does, though, is by weaving those types of elements with very well manicured lawns or ground cover beds and great hardscaping, it suddenly looks intentional. So he didn't have the board members of the Ohio State University freaking out because it did look like an intentionally designed fabulous grove of sumac and catalpa and different native plants. The same thing can be done on a smaller scale. This is Benjamin Boat, who is a landscape designer in Nebraska. And I just like he has an Instagram page that I follow called Monarch Gardens Benjamin Boat. And he chronicles throughout the year his extremely radical little garden in a suburban area. And what he's done is allowed these native plant communities, which were initially laid out and designed somewhat, he's allowed them to procreate and find their own pattern, find their own rhythm. But he's interwoven it with very mowed paths and little patches of lawn so that it is intentional looking. If he didn't have some of those elements of what we think of as a designed landscape, it could very much look abandoned to a lot of people. But what he said is there are the people that are still very upset all the time, but there are a whole lot of people always stopping and watching pollinators and watching the hummingbirds and the birds in the winter and all the different critters. So it ends up being a really great bonus and probably turns a lot of kids onto nature early, which is the most important thing we can do. And then one of the main things about making a native plant garden or any naturalistic garden, I have a pretty big love of cottage gardens and I've designed a lot of them. One of the things you run into with that more naturalistic look is it can be more maintenance than a formal garden if you're trying to keep a certain look to it. And a lot of that involves editing versus elimination. Deciding, are there certain plants that I need only where I planted them, they stay in those bounds? Or am I just editing them out? If I have plants that reseed and colonize in a garden, or say they run and spread underground, do I always keep them beaten back to where I wanted them originally? Or do I allow some of those stragglers to form their own little colonies peppered throughout the garden? So it looks a little less formal It looks a little less designed. This is a grass garden in Grant Park in downtown Chicago. Now, these are not all native grasses, but quite a few are. And what you can see is it looks somewhat natural, but also intentional all at once. And that is because they occasionally come through and find some of the stragglers, say maybe the love grass, some of it has reseeded 12 feet away from the rest of its compatriots, and it's now coming up in the switchgrass. They will probably eliminate a lot of those stragglers and maybe leave some here and there just to loosen the planting a little. But if they never did anything, it would eventually become a very meshed, mixed up cluster of grasses that might not be suitable for, you know, a very built environment like downtown Chicago. So these are some gardens I designed when I was in South Carolina. And like I said, it is a mixture of natives and non-natives. There's two things there. Like I said, I love such diversity that I just plant all different things, but also I worked for a billionaire. So what she wanted is what happened. What I would do is we had big beds. So we would do these big waves, choosing masses of certain types of plants, and then weaving those masses in and out of each other. And by doing that, you're creating that big space that's a reservoir of, like I said, nectar, pollen, food, forage, shelter for the fauna, but you're also creating this continuity for the eye to follow. And like I said, by weaving them in and out of each other, it's a very sinuous experience, and you're getting those multiple repeats of the same plants in multiple areas, once again mimicking nature. So if you see in this picture, the purple flower is the very non-native catmint or napata. I still use it because it blooms so long and it is just adored by pollinators, and it's just so easy. But you see, I've repeated it in multiple areas there because that way it's much more like nature, where there isn't just one cluster, this one plant. It's peppered throughout as it would be in its natural environment. And then we have some more native type plants there, Coreopsis, beautiful Hypericum frondosum, and the big leaf giant coneflower, which as far as I know does grow up here. We could grow it in Cincinnati beautifully. It's native in the South and has those huge blue silver rhubarb leaves, and I just can't get enough of it. So this is the garden, same about a month later in the summer. Amazingly, this garden was only less than a year old at this point. That shows the benefits of a 9-month growing season and beautiful soil. But you can see I've repeated the similar plants in multiple locations throughout. And then allowed, it's not native, but the old-fashioned cleome or spider flower, we allowed it to reseed sporadically throughout, and through editing, that was able to loosen it up without completely beating it back into one little corner. This is, if you haven't had time to go, this is the garden I took care of for about 5 years near downtown Cincinnati. The Civic Garden Center of Greater Cincinnati is a wonderful nonprofit that's been doing education and community gardening since 1942. So we had a historic property with this little historic cottage, and I cannot take credit for most of this, but this is a great example of masses of plants and how much, even in the dead of winter, you could get color and interest out of wonderful big clusters of things. We have the smooth hydrangeas that ran about 40 feet along that cottage, and what impact that has compared to just one or two. And we'll talk about this grass on the right. Absolutely one of my favorites that still no one is offering nearly enough. American beak grass, or diarrhea, maybe because it has like the worst Latin ever. But that is a wonderful native woodland grass. And then I just have to pitch, that is a native cucumber tree magnolia there that is just stunning and one of the best specimens I've ever seen. So once again, in those masses, you can do drifts, large kind of areas of interweaving, drifting materials. So it might be of a large area of one single species, but if you have a big area where you can do that and still get a lot of diversity, why not? This is once again in South Carolina, Moore Farms Botanical Garden where I worked, and they're lucky enough that pink muley grass is fully hardy and native down there. So you get these gardens that are entirely pink smoke by late summer every year. underneath the loblolly pines. This is the same garden. We actually managed this by burning it every year. It went from years of the crew cutting it down and hauling the grass away, and that took 3 days, to finally they said, what if we just burn it? It took 45 minutes and all 6 acres were clear. And obviously all these native prairie plants loved it. So once again, these big waves, because it was a large area, it could really offer diversity even with these large mass plantings, and provide lots of shelter, especially in the winter when all the grasses were up. And then lastly, incorporating plants that are structural into a garden can do a whole lot, even for a garden that could look to the conventional person like a very unkempt kind of wild garden. Utilizing plants that have a lot of structure can suddenly lend it a sense of, like I said, importance or intentionality. Suddenly it doesn't look neglected. It looks like, oh, this wasn't intended to be this way. And if you can go anywhere in the next year, I would absolutely say, go to New York. If you haven't been yet, go to the High Line. It's actually become one of the top visited attractions in New York City, amazingly. And that's exciting for horticulturists because it is essentially just a park. There's no big attractions per se, other than fabulous plant communities, really interesting stops along the way, but it is an old elevated railroad track that had reverted to a native plant community through decades of neglect. They decided to fix it up into a linear park and said, let's landscape it, referencing what was already growing here naturally for decades. So in this picture you see here, this was, I think, January that I went. And just the wild array of asters and seed heads from goldenrod, things like that. The beautiful tall upright big blue stem or andropogon there suddenly has a lot of intentionality because of that American holly right there that is really dense and full, and the paper birch is giving us that white kind of lightning bolt of interest. And even the intense form of the big blue stem itself is very sculptural. Another spot on that same area, you see this garden is very wild. It is designed, but it is really turned into a real cluster of all different colonizing species. But because of the structural trees, such as the paper birch, and there's a great colony of staghorn sumac behind it, it almost looks like an art piece. It's got these beautiful sculptural elements nestled into this really wild, boisterous garden. So one of the things that we can do to incorporate this idea through design is something I hadn't learned until about 8 years ago. One of my interns was talking about matrix planting, and because she was in architecture school, and I said, matrix planting, I don't even know what that is. And she explained it to me, and it's a really fascinating way to mimic the ideas of a natural area, but with intentional design. So what it is essentially like, this is a pollinator meadow planted in the Great Plains. And essentially matrix planting is kind of seeing something like that and saying, how can I design a space to look almost as if it happened on its own? And so what it is essentially, they call it matrix planting because it's kind of like viewing your garden as a grid or a quilt of blocks, and then trying to repeat similar plants throughout each of those blocks of the grid, so that you don't just have one plant in this corner, a different plant in this corner. You have maybe the same 5 plants repeated throughout that matrix. So it is a really multi-layered, interwoven design style in which you create a base layer that uses lower ground covering species and tighter clusters of perennials. So you have almost this carpet. Then you can intersperse it with clusters of or drifts of taller perennials, middle, knee height things, things up to your waist, and then add groupings or specimens of woody species, shrubs, or large, bold perennials, kind of peppered throughout. So we'll see, this is a landscape architect I found in Fine Gardening magazine a few years ago. His name's Adam Woodruff, and he did this great estate in rural Illinois that is exemplary of a matrix garden. And what we'll see here is the repeat of certain plants throughout in a way that is pleasing to the eye because they are repeated in multiple areas. But it's also extremely diverse in not only species, but bloom periods and layers, different heights. So what you see here is this great medley in this photo of the native Baptisia or false indigo forming big sweeps in the background. The non-native Maynite salvia, which I believe is European meadow sage, is some of the spring bloom, really intense deep blue, but it is interspersed with native grasses forming this wonderful blanket. And then these pops of really interesting foliage from the prairie dock, which is one of my favorite native plants. You see just these big leaves suddenly acting like sculpture, breaking up this carpet of very wild, loose foliage and flowers. So you might see this area here, disregard that. I might be less of a purist, but even that makes me cringe to see that loose strife all along the outer edge. I'm sure that's Morden Gleam, which they say is sterile, but I don't dare go near it. But you look at the rest of the garden and see, it might look really wild and haphazard, but if you look at the idea of a matrix planting, you start seeing, okay, so the anise hyssop or purple agastache, you see is repeated at multiple intervals throughout the space. And then it's interwoven with these exclamation points of the fabulous prairie dock. And then it's interwoven even more with the white swan coneflower, all nestled within a framework of different native grasses and oregano, and then kind of surrounded spatially with these taller featherweed grasses, and then with your really interesting sculptural element, which is the staghorn sumac. And so here's a diagram I drew to kind of explain matrix gardening one more time. The top left image would be looking at your garden from above, choosing, okay, so I'm going to use this one type of low or kind of mid-height plant. And then, okay, I want another type of mid-height plant. I'll do some more clusters. I'll incorporate another cluster. So I've created kind of a quilt of all these different really bushy plants. And then lastly, incorporating that kind of carpet to weave it all together. So you see the same plants are repeated in multiple locations of this big garden. As an example, I did that here in March of 2020. We installed a new rain garden. And this photo makes it look really pathetic, but this was literally a month after it was installed. So it's very fresh and it might look haphazard, but if you look at it closer, the center of it is essentially a matrix planting of a nice carpet of native sedge, Carex vulpinoidea, and it's interwoven with the native swamp iris. So you see this, these kind of two clusters or three clusters of iris, and then a sinuous mixture of carex all around it. The outer edges are then kind of waves of taller perennials such as switchgrass, Joe Pye weed, goldenrod, and then another couple layers of prairie drop seed and monarda and some other medium to low perennials that kind of weave in and out. So you see, this is the same garden this year, this past year in about May. You see how much it's grown together. That's the idea of right plant, right place. You see it only was 1 year and it looks like it's been there quite a while. But if you look at it closer, you start to see an intense mixture of irises and sedges interweaving with all these taller border plants. This is it from another angle. You can see the iris blooming mixed in with the sedges. The outer edges, you can see the prairie drop seed in the bottom right corner, or bottom left corner, I'm sorry. And then you can see the monarda, it's a Bee-balm monarda bradburyana is naturally like a blushing white. This was my first time trying it. I've always wanted to, and it's pretty fabulous. It's a little more native, I think, as you get more towards the southern regions and out towards central US. So it's not quite native right here, but I kind of fudged the rules a little and decided I really wanted to try it. And it is a great plant. So what you're seeing though is this interweaving. It is not directly layered, short, medium, tall. It is mixed throughout so that it creates a very natural looking space even after only 1 year. This is it in, let's see, this would be summer of the year we installed it. I know that because there's a spice bush in the top right corner that only lived 1 year because it turned out the space was a little too wet for what I thought it would be. But you do see even into just a few months of age, it was already really filling in, and it starts, you can see waves of different plants mixed together. This is it from another angle. And then this is it in the winter. This is why there's a lot of ecological reasons to not cut down everything in the fall. One of them being its incredible sheltering area, its nesting material for birds. It's an incredible how many seeds are still on plants to feed mammals and birds throughout the winter. And it also helps break up wind and create microclimates for nesting butterflies and insects, and even the tall stalks of woody perennials or hollow nesting areas for insects. So not only is it good to leave that up for those reasons, but you do get an interesting color play. And because of these masses of things, as opposed to individual plants, it looks a little more intentional. This is a garden I did in South Carolina, kind of along the same lines, where it's just interweaving mass plantings of different really cool plants. So now onto our list. So partridge pea is one of my favorite native annuals, Chamacrista fasciculata. It is a wonderful little guy for full sun, average to dry and fertile soil. And with adequate moisture, it can bloom pretty much the entire summer and fall. It's only about 12 to 18 inches high. And it's a pollinator magnet, not only because of the flowers, but the leaves themselves have something called a nectary on them, which is a little nub kind of lower in the leaf that does secrete kind of a sugary nectar for a lot of insects. Creeping sedge is one of my favorite native sedges. I'm obsessed with sedges, I will warn you, but we'll only talk about a few. It is a perennial clump former. It does reseed. It spreads a little bit underground, but not as much as the name would make you think. But it is part to full shade. Semi-evergreen are still look pretty good here this time of year, quite blue. You see it in this bottom, the left photo is actually in our rain garden there, where it's kind of just growing naturally. It still looks pretty good in the winter. It likes average to moist, rich soil. And you'll usually find the cultivar called Hob, or trade name Bunny Blue is what you'll see in the industry most often. A sedge that we used heavily in our parking lot and green learning station in Cincinnati was Pennsylvania or oak sedge, Carex pennsylvanica. It is one of those rare sedges that can tolerate drier soils even in full sun. Most sedges can tolerate full sun if it's wet, but this one can go pretty heavily into all conditions. Full sun to full shade, well-drained, average to moist soil. It does not like real wet soils like some of the sedges. It's about 12 to 18 inches tall and can be a quite vigorous spreader if it is given the conditions that it wants. All sedges are great too because they're a really good seed source for mammals and birds. One of the great perennial prairie grasses that I love as an interweaving carpet plant is purple lovegrass, or Eragrostis spectabilis. I actually bought one at the native plant sale at Toledo Botanic years ago and took it to our parking lot in Cincinnati and let it just go crazy on a sandy slope. It can handle very dry, very well-drained, poor soils, and only gets about 12 inches tall, but it spreads, not only spreads through roots and everything, but reseeds, and really can fill whole areas. It's not really particularly exciting when it's not blooming. It actually was hard to tell apart from some of the weeds when we were working, but when it is blooming, it's absolutely incredible. Barren strawberry is a pretty cool native perennial ground cover. It's called barren only because it is not very palatable to people. So being very anthropocentric, we always think, well, if it's not good for us, it's not good for anyone. But it is actually a really good food source for a lot of nature. It is sun to part shade. It tolerates heavier shade. It also likes average to well-drained soil, but is very drought tolerant. It's only about 6 to 8 inches tall, spreads pretty slowly, and has evergreen foliage underneath these little yellow typical strawberry flowers. It is pretty deer resistant, is overall just a very tough ground cover that could be a great carpet to weave through a kind of shady garden. Someone I absolutely love, I inherited a patch when I started my job in Cincinnati, is Robin's plantain. Now, the one we had was a cultivar called Lynnhaven Carpet, and that's the one you'll see offered the most. And its main difference is just that I think it's a heavier bloomer and a little more compact and dense than in nature. But it is a perennial version of our common fleabane, which there are a number of native fleabane species that are generally just annuals. But what's great about fleabanes is they're long blooming aster-like flowers. What's great about this one is that it forms a very dense carpet, kind of like a juga or bugleweed, but with a native plant. And it's this very scalloped, very hairy, kind of leathery little leaves that can form a dense carpet. And then in late spring into early summer, it sends up these foot-tall stalks just covered with these little white daisies, sometimes a little bit of a lavender tone to them. And I absolutely adore it. It is average to dry, well-drained soil, full sun to some pretty good shade. And like I said, in Cincinnati, it took a while to get going, but once it did, it sure tolerated some pretty awful soil and some pretty heavy shade. I was impressed with it. I've started some colonies here and we'll see how they do. They already spread quite a bit just from plugs. Blue wood asters, a really great perennial ground cover in wooded areas because unlike a lot of asters, it does not get tall and shrubby most of the season. It actually stays this gorgeous kind of low carpet of big leathery leaves. And then late summer through early fall, it sends up 2-foot stalks of these kind of lavendery, airy flowers, almost like baby's breath, and can form quite a thick, beautiful colony. Average to dry or moist soil. It's very tolerant, part to full shade. Like I said, the foliage is only about 10 inches tall, but when it's blooming, it's 2 to 3 feet tall. It can be a very vigorous ground cover, but the thing I found here and in South Carolina when I used it was rabbits adore asters, especially when you plant them as plugs. And until you get them established, it is really good to try to get them protected. Once they're bigger and growing vigorously, the rabbits can harvest, but brand new plants, I could not get a leaf to grow on them this year until I fenced around them. Gray sedge is one of the sedges that I just kind of get a little googly-eyed over. Full sun, it can tolerate if it has wet soil, consistent moisture. But in the shade, it's quite drought tolerant, but still prefers average moisture. It's an upright, dense, arching habit, 18 to 24 inches tall, maybe even taller if it's very happy. And what I love is it gets these really cool Sputnik shaped barbed seed heads in the summer that are kind of lime green and just showy as heck. And it's pretty reliably evergreen. Ours in the parking lot here, it looks beaten up, but it still has quite a bit of green to it. And then this is that grass I was telling you that the biggest frustration I have is I just can't get people to grow it. Diarrhea obovata and Diarrhea americana are 2 native species known as beak grass or beak grain. Like I said, I think the Diarrhea, just that horrible Latin, is holding it back. I wish they could give it a really pretty name, but it is a part to full shade woodland grass. It's about 12 to 18 inches tall and only about 2 feet wide. So it really creates that nice space in the range of where hostas and native ginger and different things live. And it reseeds quite well if it's happy and spreads slowly by rhizomes as well. What's great about it that I loved even more than the summer was the way it turns gold and amber in the fall and holds well through the winter. So you see there in that photo at the Civic Garden Center, that was midwinter and that was really, really stunning every year. And it's a great seed source, just like the sedges, it's a great seed source for birds and mammals. A ground cover I love to use in the shade This is golden ragwort or golden groundsel, Pacera aurea. It used to be senecio. This is a great scalloped, very deep green, very glossy leaves, very rounded, and it forms pretty vigorously if it's happy. It will pretty vigorously form big colonies of ground covering foliage. That looks great all summer, even into the winter. It can be somewhat evergreen. And then in spring, it sends up these 2 to 3 foot kind of leafless stalks of yellow, intense yellow daisies. It loves part to full shade, only about 8 to 12 inches tall when it's foliage, and then blooming 2 to 3 feet higher. It can tolerate wet, low areas. In fact, it loves them. So if you have an area that just stays kind of damp or wet, you know, a place where you have ostrich ferns or some of those other great woodland ephemerals that or perennials that love wet, this is a good plant to grow. And then one of the native goldenrods that I love is blue stem goldenrod or Solidago sacea. I love it because it's more of a woodland goldenrod, and I have found it in South Carolina and here and all different areas I've gone, blooming in late summer into fall. On these little kind of very airy, very delicate plants. They don't look as coarse as a lot of goldenrods, and I just love the way they arch along the stem like that. Goldenrods in general are just an incredible seed source for birds. We don't talk about that as much. And obviously a fabulous source of pollen and nectar for pollinators late in the season when they're really needing it. One of my favorite natives ever since a dear friend taught it to me in Cincinnati is rattlesnake master, Eryngium yuccafolium. The yuccafolium is implying it is yucca-like, and that is true. The leaves are very blue, very leathery, and with kind of these toothed edges, so it gives you a very structural element like a yucca. Unlike a yucca, if you change your mind, you won't be fighting it in that same spot for 50 years, but it is a deep-rooted, very tough little native perennial. Full sun, average soil to drought tolerant. You don't want to enrich soil or it will tend to flop. Same with part shade. It will be kind of floppy in part shade. The foliage is only about 12 to 18 inches tall, but when it's flowering, it's about 3 to 4 feet tall. It's got these great spiked globes of flowers on the stalks. This is a photo out at University of Toledo on the left side. That is a great source of nectar for pollinators. It's absolutely very popular in the summer with bees, but it is also a good source of seed for the birds. Aromatic aster. So I love asters, but I have to admit New England aster always stressed me out in terms of landscape design because it gets very tall and gets, you know, what they call naked legs, partially because it gets lace bugs that really dry out the leaves and riddle them and kind of make them parchment-like. So not only their legs kind of barren, but they're also brown. And then all the flowers are at the top. I love aromatic aster, Symphytrichum oblongifolium. They changed the Latin because aster was just too easy to say. I like this plant because it's fuller all the way down to the ground and very round and bushy to the point that in the summer when it's not blooming, it really just looks like a shrub, which I really like. But then in terms of flowers, the flowers are very similar to New England aster, but they're just all the way from the top to the ground, just the whole dang plant. It loves average to dry soil, just like the other New England asters, full to part sun. It can be later blooming than a lot of the others, which is a really good bonus. It's about 2 to 3 feet tall and wide on average. And it's known for a fuller form. And like I said, no naked legs. Generally, unless you grow it from seed or find it as plugs, you're generally going to find it as a cultivar. 2 of the most common being October skies and radon's favorite. This photo on the right is radon's favorite. Nodding onion. This is a photo in the middle of August, actually, at University of Toledo. So about 2 months later than they say it normally would bloom. It is full to part sun, average to moist soils, very drought tolerant, and it's about 12 to 18 inches tall and wide. The summer flowers can occur, as I said, over a very long period, and it is really just like all the onions. It's really good for pollinators, very resistant to herbivory by other mammals. So just a dependable stalwart in the garden. Slender mountain mint or Pycnanthemum tenuifolium. I love all of the mountain mints, but this one I especially like because it's a little less aggressive than some of the others, and it has these really airy, finely cut leaves. So it gives you this very full, bushy, just delicate counterpoint to a lot of other plants in the garden. And then just like the other mountain mints, it has these very delicate white to slightly lavender flowers atop the very fragrant foliage. Like all the mountain mints, it's absolutely just a pollinator magnet. And like the other mountain mints, it's also extremely adaptable to so many situations. Average, well-drained soil, very tolerant of dry, extremely tolerant of wet, full to part sun. Just a really key plant that can solve a lot of problems in the garden when you just don't know what to use. Brown-eyed Susan is one that I love, Rudbeckia triloba. She's a biennial, so very small flowers compared to other black-eyed Susans, but by the thousands. And it gets about 2 to 3 feet tall when it's blooming, and only about 12 inches tall when it's foliage its first year. So what I like about it is you can let it reseed throughout the garden and then just edit out the ones you don't want. So what it can do is create a looser, more naturalistic garden. You see in this photo in Raleigh on the right, a park I went to, if you don't weed it at all, it will fill an area. But in my garden, I would weed out a lot of the ones I didn't want. I'd allow some to colonize throughout, and that created this really beautiful, kind of more naturalistic look. It is also one that is a little more shade tolerant than some other Rudbeckia. So I could really go into the high canopy woodland area with it as well. Silphium is one of my absolute favorite families of plants. And one of my favorites of that family are the cup plant, Silphium perfoliatum. It's a full sun to part shade. Its loves average to very wet soils. It actually thrives here along our river walk, going down to the Maumee River. And this is a bold beast of a plant, 6 to 7 feet tall minimum when it's blooming, 3 to 4 feet wide also as a minimum. It just is bold, it's big, it's fabulous. It's a back of the border thing to use. But I mean, it's one of those that will get people asking you what it is, whether they could care less about plants in general. They will be interested, especially when they see the cool feature, which would be the way the leaves whirl and join around the stem to form a cup that does catch water and is a beneficial source of water for animals. The other one, like I said, is my serious weakness in the Silphium family is prairie dock, Silphium terebinthaceum. And I love it because it has these massive paddle leaves that are very leathery, very coarse, and just so structural. And they'll carry your garden with just beautiful structure most of the summer, 18 to 24-inch huge leaves. And then suddenly, as if that's not enough, late summer, you get these 8, 9, 10-foot tall stalks of flowers. What I love about these is you can use really tall plants like this even further forward in the garden because of two things. One, most of the year it's not very tall. Second thing is when it does become tall, it's a very see-through tall because they are completely leafless stalks, 4 or 5 feet higher than your head. You can see right through them. It's this really interesting way to create almost a semi-sheer screen. So I love to use it in the front of the bed, in the middle of the bed, in the back of the bed, and not have such a layered look. Culver's root or Veronicastrum virginicum is the one that I used along the edges of our rain garden in Cincinnati. It is a really nice perennial for very candle-like little white flowers atop a tall plant, 5 to 6 feet tall. What I love about it is the foliage is what's called whorled, where it comes in these perfect little circles all the way around the stem at very distinct levels. So it gives this very stair-step pagoda look. The plant is just overall delicate looking, but it isn't delicate as a grower. It's quite tough, average to wet soils, somewhat drought tolerant, full to part sun, and relatively deer resistant. What I like is not only are the leaves beautiful, but when it starts blooming, it's a real stunning plant mid to late summer. And then kind of with the similar look, but in the deep, intense purple is the native blue vervain or Verbena hastata. I love this plant because it kind of, if you provide an area in your garden that's reasonably wet, it will often just show up on its own. We have it come up in areas here that are just, I didn't plant it, and then I'm very happy and I'll let it grow and sometimes divide it and move it. It's full sun to part shade, average to very wet soils, 2 to 5 feet tall by 2 to 3 feet wide, so it doesn't take up a lot of room, and just gives you this extremely long period of these intense purple electric flowers. It's a favorite of pollinators, a good seed source for birds. And then one that gives you a kind of an aster-like look in late summer all through fall is Boltonia asteroides, or false aster. So it's not a true aster, but what I love is it has very silvery blue leaves over a very cloudy, big shrubby plant all summer. And then, like I said, late season, it just erupts into this cloud of white flowers. This is at Cincinnati Zoo in the edge of their rain garden. This is a really good example of it. It's big. It gets 4 to 6 feet tall, 3 to 4 feet wide minimum, spreads underground to form a nice dense colony. Obviously, the happier it is, the bigger it gets. In a drier, more stressful area, it will be a smaller plant. And then one of my my loves of really bold architectural plants is the Native American spikenard. So if you know Aurelia, it's like more commonly a house plant, and some really great Asian southern plants that are very traditional, like Castor Aurelia and things like that. This is one of the few that are the native Aurelias, and it's huge. It gets 3, 4, 5 feet tall and wide. I've seen 6 or 7 footers when the conditions are great. It loves part to full shade, average to rich, moist soils, well drained, but it can tolerate clay and rocky soils. Gets these huge compound leaves and these big, kind of astilbe like creamy flowers in early summer. Those, if they're pollinated, turn into these dangling kind of grape clusters of magenta and purple berries, which are pretty great for the wildlife. It is, even though it's huge, it's completely herbaceous. It dies to the ground and you forget about it till spring, and then it just comes right back up again. So now I know we're running a little late. We'll go into, we just have 5 or 6 shrubs. The viburnum, I love all the viburnum, but it has been challenging the past number of years. The invasive viburnum leaf beetle has moved into Ohio from the Northeast and has really threatened a lot of the native viburnum. Luckily, it sounds like in the Northeast, they found that the initial infestations kind of declined naturally over the years, and they aren't as stressed out as they were. But it is good to understand the threat and know that all the native viburnum are a little stressed out. Some of the ones that are beaten up the most, though, are arrowwood viburnum, which is one of my favorites. So I'm not using that species a lot right now. But one of the ones that's more resistant and very landscape friendly, and I've always loved, is black haw viburnum, viburnum prunifolium. Prunifolium means cherry-like or cherry leaf. The leaves look just like a beautiful cherry. It's a full sun to full shade plant. It can tolerate average to seasonally wet soils or drought soils. It grows huge, 10 to 15 feet tall and wide. Spreads underground to form colonies. Just a fabulous edge of the garden plant. It can be trained into single trunk trees, and sometimes cities are planting them that way. Late spring flowers are not fragrant like the Asian viburnums. They tend to have kind of that musty odor like a hawthorn. But those, if they're pollinated, turn into a bluish black fruit in the summer and fall. And then this is some of the best fall color of the viburnums: reds, oranges, yellows. And like I said, it's a little more resistant to viburnum leaf beetle. The other viburnum I love for a small element, we had a little grove of these in Cincinnati. It was viburnum acerifolium, or maple leaf viburnum. It's only 2 to 6 feet tall and 3 to 4 feet wide, so it's quite small for a viburnum. And it loves average to rich, moist soils. It can be relatively drought tolerant. We had it on kind of a drier slope, and it was hanging in there. The flowers are similar to the viburnum prunifolium, just kind of a white flat top, turning into blackish blue little berries. And then it does have this really kind of intriguing reddish, rosy tone fall color. This one's another one like the Aurelia. It's not a true shrub. It's herbaceous or dies back completely each year, but I love wild senna. It's Senna marilandica. I believe it used to be cassia, I swear that's what I learned it as. It's a full sun, absolute lover of hot, dry, even infertile soils. Like a lot of legumes, it's beneficial to infertile soils. It gets about 3 to 4 feet tall and wide. I have seen bigger than that. And then it has just a very long bloom period in summer with these huge clusters of yellow flowers. Those do turn into interesting seed pods that can hang on in the winter. They look kind of like deep brown or black snow peas. And then it also, just like the partridge pea, not only has beneficial flowers, but has those nectaries incorporated on the stems and leaves that attract a lot of other insects. Nine bark is a real love. The industry's really embraced nine bark, but mostly it's purple leaf or gold leaf cultivars, which are interesting and have their place, but by no means look natural. The straight species is an absolute favorite. It's actually, if you look at it, you start to see it. It's related to spirea. So it has the look of the old bridal wreath spirea in a lot of ways. Beautiful kind of maple leaves, white clusters of flowers in late spring, early summer, and just a really great arching habit, just like a spirea would have. Beautiful arching branches. But unlike spirea, this fabulous peeling bark, hence the name nine bark, it looks like layers and layers of bark. It likes average to moist soils. It can grow in full sun to quite a bit of shade, and is 5 to 8 feet tall and wide is pretty average. This is another one that the industry is stressing me out because it's making it really hard to find. And I don't get why, because it would solve so many people's dilemmas in the garden, which is coralberry or Symphoricarpus orbiculatus. It's full sun to full shade. I mean, this thing's unkillable once it gets going. 2 to 3 feet tall, but spreading pretty much indefinitely. I was holding down a shaded deer-prone slope under a red maple in Cincinnati, if that helps you know how tough this plant is. Average soil, but very drought tolerant. And what was great was it would send out these long rhizomes that would be 4 or 5 feet long and root as they went. So I was holding down a 45-degree slope with it. Deer don't like it, but the birds do. And so do pollinators. When it's blooming in summer, it's these little rosy white flowers that are followed by these intense clusters of deep kind of pink berries that hold on pretty much the entire winter. So it is interesting. And then lastly, for a kind of beautiful shrubby alternative to, knockout roses or spirea, I love St. John's wort, and there are quite a few wonderful native options. One of the ones most commonly available is one that is native to the Midwest, which is called St. John's wort or Hypericum culminanum. Really glossy, very finely cut leaves, almost like rosemary. And these wonderful yellow flowers, just heavy blooming with the little pom-poms of pollen, just a straight, heavy performer, and absolutely intriguing full plant. And as a bonus, it does have peeling bark as it gets older on older stems. Most commonly, you'll find it in cultivar form as Sunny Boulevard or Ames are two very reliable varieties that have been around for quite a while. And just an absolute fabulous plant for full to part sun, deer resistant, pretty much anything you could need for a tough garden plant. So that was the really quick rundown of plants. I have my email on here, and I think Kate said she'll send out my email address as well when she sends you the other information. So if any of you have questions, or which you might, because I know we blew through this really fast. If you have any other questions or anything you want to talk about, absolutely. I'm always excited to talk design and native plants and all different things. So please do contact me. And hopefully we still have time for questions if anyone wants.
We definitely have time for questions for anyone who wants. If you want to please put your questions in the chat, or if you want to unmute and ask your question, either way.
Now, Angie, do I have a way to see the chat, or are you seeing that?
You can see the chat as well if you want. If you go across the bottom of your screen, the chat should be a middle option that you can click on, and it should show on the side.
I see. Okay, let's see. I see someone did say the prairie or the beak grass looks like a native replacement for Hakone grass, and that is funny. That's how I have talked about it in other presentations. It is identical in texture, and the winter and fall interest is just as stunning, because I do love Hakone grass. But yeah, I mean, it's just a great plant. And Hoffman grasses is a specialist in native grasses. They still haven't grown it. I keep pushing them. It's just really hard to find. You can get seed from a number of places if you're ready to grow it on your own, but I do recommend it.
We do have a couple of questions coming in here at the bottom of the chat.
Yes. Okay, I see one is, do you cut back aromatic asters in the spring? So yes, all asters you do cut back at the end of winter, early spring. Now, what you can do with asters and pretty much any perennials that bloom late summer into fall is you can also shear them again in late May, early June. You can take maybe a third of the height off, and that will cause them to bloom shorter. So if you tend to have issues with things getting too big or getting too tall and lodging, which is the fancy term for falling over, you can do that. You can do that with a lot of asters, sedums, goldenrods. Like I said, if it's a mid to late summer bloomer, or especially fall bloomer, cutting back in June can really help you kind of get a heavier bloom on a shorter plant. Let's see. In terms of mentioned cultivars, that one is tough with prioritizing straight species. I've noticed a lot of the American Beauty series is straight species, which is really exciting. I know then we open the can of worms of not being able to get local genotype and all those, but my feeling is, here's the deal. If we're gonna poo-poo purple leaf 9 bark because it's not straight species, but the only other option is then that contractor goes out and plants 20 barberry instead, I think we would have been better off with the cultivar that at least had beneficial flowers in some aspects. So I do feel like I'm never going to be against nativars. I do love the idea. I do love the idea of having a more straight species, and that is one where you often have to either source them from really great suppliers, like here in town, Popping Up Native. She is working local genotype straight species. You can get them from places like Prairie Moon. I'm sure a lot of you would know a lot more native sources than I do even. I get some from, I get quite a few as plug trays from North Creek Nurseries, but that is out of northern Pennsylvania. So it's similar latitude, but a little further away. But I do like, I can find a lot of things there. And let's see. Next I see the prairie dock flower stalks in the wind. They're extremely strong. We had them along an extremely busy exposed road in downtown Cincinnati, and I never had one flop into the sidewalk. Absolutely incredible plant, and one of those that it does offer that nesting site in the winter for a lot of insects, so it's okay to leave them standing for a while into the spring. I see someone wrote, has the soil at 577 been amended? A lot of it has, yes. Now that rain garden is actually, we did not build it properly. We kind of just were like, let's dig a hole. That's a rain garden, right? And so it was actually very heavy clay and was not draining well, which is why some of the plants I used that like seasonally wet ground, such as the spice bush. So we did end up amending it with some compost, but overall, luckily, choosing the right plants for the right places, most of them adapted to that heavy soil. And a lot of the other gardens here, yeah, it's a 90-year-old estate, so there's a lot of soils that have just been worked, weeded, tilled, all different things for so long that they're all pretty great soils. We do have quite a bit of clay here being near the river, so it is heavy in some spots. But I am lucky to have a pretty great soil base here. Let's see. Any native plants that I don't recommend for landscaping. I know I'll get in trouble for this, but I don't recommend common milkweed for a lot of situations because it's up there with bamboo for me in terms of running out of where I want it. I love Asclepias, and I use the butterfly weed and I use swamp milkweed because they clump better. And then I love common milkweed when I have areas where I don't mind something spreading 10, 12 feet from where I planted it. But in a lot of our smaller gardens here, it has become a very troublesome plant. And really last year, the only thing we had eating it was the burdock caterpillar. We had no, or the I can't remember, I'm blanking the name, but it was not, we only had 2 monarch caterpillars here last year. The rest of them were loaded with one of the other native caterpillars. So it is a very beneficial plant, but personally, I think if you're trying to be on that tight balance with a cranky HOA in your neighborhood, I am very careful with common milkweed. But in the right spot, it's a fabulous plant. I think sedge is good for roadways. I think pretty much all of them can handle the snowplow. The main thing would be to choose sedges that can handle wet, because the main thing that's going to kill you with a lot of plants is that wet, heavy moisture sitting for long periods. It would also be a matter of looking into which ones are more salt tolerant. I can't say offhand of what all those would be, but yeah, things that can handle quite a bit of wet, like that gray sedge, the one I use in the garden, which is Alpinoidea. You could also use things like the native rushes, the juncus plants, can handle pretty heavy, wet piles of snow and different things. Spray. Okay. And cutting back the native garden in the spring, that one I'm still learning as I go. But I do try to leave as much up as I can, at least into through the end of March. Some of the taller stuff I might leave up. Some of the things that I know are kind of refuges for insects and cocoons and things, I might leave some of those standing in the backs of the borders, but being in a public spot here, I have to try to clean up reasonably well in the spring. But like I said, I don't do anything in most of the garden until March or early April. And I always have to tell people it's partially because I'm tired in the fall, but it really is for a reason. So yeah. If anyone has any input on that, I would love to find out the best time to cut it back in the spring, because I don't know as well. Even though my brother's an entomology professor, I should know better about when a lot of these critters emerge. But like I said, late March through mid-April is when I really start cleaning things up. Yeah, I see. Hypericum communinum clay soil. I found that even though it likes in its native environment sandier, well-draining soils, I found it to tolerate some clay okay. I used it in Cincinnati, which is a heavier soil than here, and it did quite well. So in terms of salt, that one I don't know. I still need to learn salt stuff a little more, because I do know salt is used more up here than Southern Ohio. And I wasn't near the ocean in South Carolina, so I didn't have that experience there either. But yes, I would assume that Hypericum, it just seems like something that would handle some pretty rough situations. So it wouldn't surprise me if it's fine with salt. But more than anything, now one of the things you can do in an area that gets a lot of salt in the spring, when it starts to wake up, you can obviously flush the soil really well, just running water on it for a long time. But some people will put gypsum down on the soil, and it actually can bind well with salt molecules and drag them deeper into the soil when you kind of flood the area. So I do know some people that do that who are near very heavily salted roadways to try to lessen that salt accumulation. Were there any questions that I didn't get to? I'm sure I missed some.
There was one earlier on about what resources do you use when you're creating your designs?
Oh, well, luckily one of my resources was a mom who just wanted me to draw when I was annoying, so I drew a lot as a kid. But resources, I just like to, I'm trying to think, in terms of design, I'm really obsessed right now with there's an author named Claudia West. She is a plant representative and was a salesperson at North Creek Nurseries. I don't know if she's still there. She's a darling of the kind of the matrix design community. She's originally from Germany. She's pretty fabulous. You might look her up once again, Claudia West. I really like obviously Doug Tallamy's books because he talks about design, not just habitat creation, but how it fits in the urban environment. He really goes into that. And then, yeah, I more than anything, I just love going, just traveling and seeing other gardens in the region and seeing what looks good, you know, and then exploring the plant palette and trying to figure out the situations in which it looks good, you know. So like that idea with the salt tolerant sedge, I might go to Chicago, which I am this summer, and I'll see, okay, which sedges are they maybe using near the roadways and who looks good and who doesn't. And then just going, you know, hiking and stuff around here and getting inspired by what's going on in the natural setting and looking at it with the idea as a designer and saying like, why is this appealing to me? Obviously it's just beautiful, but why am I reading it as beautiful? And actually breaking it down in a way and starting to see like, okay, what are the colors and textures working and where are they repeating throughout the landscape? So it's kind of like someone who could read music, looking at a landscape and trying to read it for aesthetics and saying like, okay, why am I reacting? What is it saying to me? Yeah, that's that. I make it sound like I'm an idiot. I'm mostly just an idiot, but occasionally I have like a moment where it's just, you know, light bulbs. But yeah, I will tell you, Toledo, one of the things that brings me such joy is the metro parks here. And anytime I need inspiration, all I have to do is go walk in Wildwood for a few hours or ride my bike down the university trails or go out to oak openings. So I think the resources here are incredible for the size of this city. I think we're just so lucky to have that. I don't think Cincinnati can compare, and it was a 4 times bigger city. So yeah, I hope that helps. Like I said, I've always enjoyed design and it comes kind of naturally to me. And like I said, I love just going to botanical gardens and natural areas and trying to figure out why they speak to me, or if something causes me to have a kind of gut reaction that I don't like, well, what's upsetting me about it, you know? So yeah.
Okay. Well, how about one final question here? There's a question about how do you weed?
Oh, well, I trick interns into doing it. That's called being in your 40s. You've earned it by then. No, how do I weed? Well, that's also one of those that I'm very lucky that I can like within a second tell if a plant belongs or not. I can tell from like the minute it comes up what it is. I feel lucky with that. I don't have skills to balance my checkbook or anything else though, if that makes you feel better. That's one of the only things I can't do. But I weed with the idea of being, looking at the ones that are absolutely eradicate all of them. You know, okay, so that's easy. Just go through and wipe out all this chickweed. I don't need chickweed in this garden. You can go into autopilot and just go. But then there's other plants that I really try to think like, okay, if this is black-eyed Susans that have reseeded in different areas, being a little more conservative to start and saying, okay, where would I be okay with more black-eyed Susans growing? Or where do these are they not offensive right now, but let them get a little bigger so I can move them someplace I do need them. So treating your garden like a free nursery is like one of my favorite things to do. The other thing would be, like I said, most plants are like furniture. You can move them at some point or another. And so, yeah, with more desirable plants that are reseeding, when I find them, I kind of go into that situation. Can I leave it here and still achieve a great look? If I don't want it here, do I just eradicate it? Or if I don't want it here, do I dig it and move it where I do want it? And rearranging, like I said, that, for example, that brown-eyed Susan, she reseeds quite well. And so when I find her, I pull a lot of them, and a lot of them end up in the compost heap. But a whole lot of them just get moved maybe 2 feet over to where I do need that height and that looseness. A lot of them are left where they are, but yeah, they get rearranged, they get moved around. Some go to, go to plant heaven. But but yeah, that's kind of how I go about it. And the good thing is, like with that rain garden, it's only 2 years old. We didn't weed it this entire summer. The outer edges we had to weed because they're along the gravel paths, but that inner area, I got in it once in the spring for cleanup and digging out some weeds, and then I got in it once in the fall to get some weeds out. So when you plant really densely, especially with this matrix idea of heavily layered, you just don't get weeds. And if you do, they're so hidden in there, they're not offensive anymore. So yeah, that's kind of my things. Plant it heavy, and then you don't have to spend all that money on mulch, and you don't have to spend all that time weeding. So yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Bennett. We appreciate your time and definitely all the great knowledge that you shared with us tonight. We appreciate everybody for coming as well. Kate, did you have any other final words?
No, just to also thank Bennett. That was a great presentation. You probably saw in the comments, you got a lot of thank yous and very nice comments in the chat box. Just to remind everybody once again, submit any native gardening questions to our Wild Ones Gmail account by this Saturday, and we will address as many of them as we can at our meeting next month. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and have a great evening. And thanks again, Bennett.
Thank you so much.